Funding for Off 90 is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Flying back in the 1920s was a real experience. People dressed right to the nines for the experience on it because only 5% of the population had ever been up at the time. So people dressed for the experience. They told their friends, they had well-wishers to see them off, and they had bragging rights, so to speak, on it. It says, I flew in an airplane. We have the Ford Trimotor here. It's one of only two in the world that you can ride in. So it's a pretty unique opportunity to go all the way back to a 1929 airplane. I'm Jim Hansen. I'm the airport manager, City of Albert Lea. Well, the Trimotor wasn't the first airliner, but it was the first, call it practical airliner. Ford decided that we should have all metal airplanes on it, and they should be safe airplanes, so having the Ford Motor Company behind it actually helped produce this airplane. And having the Ford backing on it has made it acceptable to the public as something that, my gosh, this thing just might be dependable enough and safe enough for the public to ride in. Well, the Ford was actually a victim of its own success. It started in 1926. This particular one is 1929. But when people saw that they could fly with a reasonable expectation of getting there because of weather on it, more people wanted to fly, and the Fords weren't quite big enough. They did extend the Ford and make a bigger version of it, but it still had fixed landing gear and it was still very slow. So the public kept clamoring for bigger and faster airlines, and the airlines asked the manufacturers to produce those airplanes. After that, it was relegated to short-haul airlines or flying cargo or barnstorming out in the field, kind of like what we do today. In the days of the Ford Trimotor, you would literally be cruising 1,000 feet above the ground, and you could watch the farms and the cities go by. You'd have a unique perspective on the world, as opposed to flying along at 30 and 40,000 feet and looking at disembodied populace down on the ground, ignoring entire towns of 150,000 people of population, for example. It was a more personable time. Everybody had a window seat. Everybody had was an interactive experience with this kind of an aircraft. It's sponsored by the Vintage Aircraft Association. And VAA is a part of the Experimental Aircraft Association. It's a nonprofit, and it's dedicated to preserving old airplanes. EAA bought the airplane intending to only use it in their museum, and they looked at it and it says, you know, we can make this thing fly. And they got parts of 5 different airplanes, and they managed to put the thing together. I started flying here in 1962 when I was 15 years old, but you've got to be 16 to solo. So I had to wait till my birthday, May 1st of 1963, in order to solo. We had an event here, they called it a Skyrama, and it was a big event here in town. And they'd invited in the Ford Trimotors to hop rides here for the general public. Also in attendance was another Minnesota resident, famed pilot Max Conrad, long-distance pilot, holder of many of the long-distance records still today. And the owner of the Ford asked, he said, Max, he says, would you like to fly the airplane? And he said, sure. So Max came back and said, would you like to be my co-pilot? So I got to fly 3 times with Max Conrad, and it was in this very airplane, 49 years and 11 months ago. So close enough to 50 years. There are 18 Fords remaining out of 199 built, and it's one of only 2 in the world that you can get a ride on. This is part of our history. there's hardly anybody that hasn't heard of a Ford Trimotor. The airplane is famous. It's something of a hero, I guess. So they're relatively few and they're relatively rare, and yes, that makes them expensive, but it's worth it.
Funding for Off 90 is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.